There is a particular kind of love you have for the town you grew up in. Not the town itself, exactly, but the version of it that lives inside you, assembled from childhood memories and the smell of specific seasons and the faces of people who watched you learn to ride a bike. That love doesn't disappear when you find out the town is rotten. It just becomes a more complicated thing to carry. I grew up in Harlow, Vermont, population 2,200 at its peak, probably closer to 1,900 now. The kind of town that gets photographed in autumn by people driving through on their way somewhere else. White church steeple, covered bridge, general store with a porch, maple trees that go so red in October they look like they're burning. A town that looks, from the outside, exactly like the idea of a small town is supposed to look. I left at 18 for college in Burlington, came back at 26 when my mother got sick, stayed after she died because leaving felt like abandonment, and because my father needed someone nearby, and because Harlow, for all its smallness, had a gravitational pull I hadn't fully accounted for in my calculations about my own life. I became the town's part-time archivist and records manager, a role created almost accidentally when the previous archivist retired and nobody else applied, and I settled into the particular rhythms of a life lived in a place where everyone knows your name and your parents' names, and often your grandparents' names. My father, Robert Voss, was a well-regarded man in Harlow, retired school principal, volunteer fire department, 30 years on the town select board, the kind of man who got a hand-painted sign in the window of the general store on his 70th birthday that said, "Happy birthday, Bob," and people stopped in all day to shake his hand. I loved him with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who had never had a reason to look too closely. What I found in the archives changed that. It changed everything. It started, as things often do, with something that appeared to be nothing. It was February of last year, deep winter, the kind of cold that makes Harlow feel like the last inhabited place on Earth. I was reorganizing a section of the physical archive, boxes of documents from the 1970s and 1980s that had never been properly cataloged, the accumulated paperwork of a town going about its business, when I found a folder that had been misfiled. It was tucked inside a box of routine road maintenance records from 1984, and it contained 3 documents that had no business being in that box. The first was a handwritten letter, unsigned, addressed to then-Mayor Gerald Fitch. The second was what appeared to be a partial incident report, typed on an old typewriter, with the top section removed, the section that would have contained the case number, the date, and the reporting officer's name. The third was a single photograph, black and white, showing a stretch of woods I recognized as the tree line behind what is now the Harlow Community Center, which was built in 1986. In the photograph, there were 2 men standing at the edge of the trees. One of them was facing the camera, one of them had his back turned. The man facing the camera was Gerald Fitch. I recognized him from photographs in the archive. He'd been mayor from 1979 to 1991. The man with the back turned was wearing a jacket I recognized, a specific jacket, a Harlow Volunteer Fire Department jacket with a particular patch on the left shoulder that I had seen in a photograph on my father's mantelpiece my entire childhood. The photograph on the mantelpiece was from 1983. My father was 31 years old in it. He was wearing that jacket. I sat with those 3 documents for a long time before I touched anything else. The handwritten letter was partial, the first page only, no signature, no date. What I could read of it referred to the matter we discussed, and ensuring this doesn't surface, and the agreement between us remains binding. The language was careful in the way language is careful when the writer knows they're describing something they shouldn't be describing in writing, but feels compelled to do so anyway. Insurance, perhaps, of the dangerous kind. The partial incident report was harder to parse. The body of it described a response to a reported disturbance in the wooded area behind what the report called the Alderman property, a name I recognized as the family that had owned the land before the town acquired it for the community center. The report described an individual who had been found and transported. It did not say where, it did not say by whom. The bottom of the report contained 2 signatures, both partially legible. One appeared to begin with the letters H. Cal, which in a town the size of Harlow pointed clearly to Hank Calloway, who had been county sheriff from 1978 to 1995. Hank Calloway, who had died in 2019, who had been eulogized in the Harlow Gazette as a dedicated public servant. The other signature was not legible. I did not tell my father what I had found, not yet. Instead, I did what archivists do. I dug. The Harlow records from 1983 and 1984 were inconsistent in a specific way I hadn't noticed before because I hadn't been looking. There were gaps, not dramatic, not obvious, but present when you knew to look for them. Town meeting minutes from November 1983 referenced a pending matter related to the alderman parcel, without further elaboration, and then the following month's minutes contained no reference to it at all, as though the pending matter had simply resolved itself off the record. A land transfer document from early 1984 showed the alderman property moving to town ownership at a price significantly below assessed value, with the transaction approved unanimously and without recorded discussion. I pulled the Harlow Gazette archives. The Gazette had been running since 1946 and had covered everything in this town: school board elections, barn fires, the time a moose got into the IGA in 1997. I went through every issue from 1983 and 1984. In the September 14, 1983 issue, there was a small notice, 4 sentences, bottom of the 3rd page, reporting that a man named Thomas Alden Briggs, 34 years old, described as a transient laborer who had been working seasonally in the area, had gone missing. It noted that local authorities were looking into it and invited anyone with information to contact the sheriff's department. There was no follow-up in any subsequent issue. Thomas Alden Briggs. I wrote the name in my notebook and then sat very still for a while. I searched the name in every database I had access to: death records, vital records, census records, the partial digitization of state archives from that era. Thomas Alden Briggs appeared in a 1980 Vermont census record, Harlow, seasonal address, and in a 1982 employment record for a logging contractor that operated in the county. After September 1983, he did not appear anywhere. Not a death certificate, not a record of him surfacing in another state, not an obituary, not a missing persons resolution of any kind. He had simply stopped existing. I need to tell you what I was feeling at this point, because I think it matters to the story. I was not feeling like a detective on the verge of a breakthrough. I was feeling like someone standing at the edge of something very dark, with the growing understanding that people I loved were on the other side of it. My father's jacket in that photograph, the unsigned letter referencing an agreement, the sheriff's signature on a document that had been hidden in the wrong box for 40 years. I called my friend Diane, who is a journalist in Burlington, and I told her what I'd found. Not everything. I wasn't ready for everything to leave my hands yet, but enough. Diane asked me 2 questions. She asked if I was safe, which I appreciated, and she asked if I wanted her help. I said yes to both. Over the following 6 weeks, Diane and I worked in parallel. She used her journalist's access to dig into Thomas Alden Briggs from the outside, tracking down distant family, running searches I didn't have access to, making calls to state records offices. I worked the archive from the inside, methodically, going through every box from that era with new eyes. What we assembled, piece by piece, was not a complete picture. It was never going to be a complete picture, because 40 years had passed, and records had been lost or destroyed or misfiled by design, and the people who had been there were mostly dead or elderly or both. But it was enough of a picture to understand the shape of what had happened.
Thomas Briggs had, in the late summer of 1983, apparently witnessed or stumbled upon something on the Alderman property, something Diane's source, a retired state police officer who asked not to be named, described with careful vagueness as an incident involving individuals with significant local standing. The nature of the incident remained unclear. What was clearer from the documents and from Diane's source was what had happened afterward. Briggs had been, and I am choosing my words here as carefully as the unsigned letter had chosen its, managed. The incident had been buried. The land had been acquired quietly and built upon literally with a community center that opened in 1986 and had hosted 37 years of town meetings and Christmas concerts and youth basketball leagues. Several men had been involved in the management of what had happened. Gerald Fitch, then mayor, now 20 years dead, Hank Calloway, then sheriff, now 5 years dead, 2 or 3 others whose identities remained partially obscured, and my father who was still alive, who made his own coffee every morning in the house I grew up in, who had a hand-painted birthday sign from the general store, who had never, in my entire life, given me a reason to look too closely. I drove to his house on a Sunday. I didn't tell him I was coming. I sat across from him at his kitchen table with a copy of the photograph, the woods, Gerald Fitch, the back of a man in a fire department jacket, and I put it between us, and I watched his face. He looked at it for a long time. His hands on the table were very still. Then he said, "Where did you find this?" I told him. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not surprised but had hoped to be. What followed was the longest conversation I have ever had with my father. It lasted 4 hours. He asked me once quietly if I was recording it. I said no. I don't know if he believed me. I was not recording it. I only have my memory of what he said, which I wrote down in my notebook that evening in as much detail as I could recover, and which I will not reproduce here in full because some of it is not mine to share, and some of it involved other people's names, and some of it I am still honestly trying to process. What he told me in the broad shape of it was this. Thomas Briggs had apparently confronted Gerald Fitch about something. My father was vague on the specifics, and I believe his vagueness was partly genuine, that he had been told only what he needed to know. There had been an altercation. Briggs had been hurt. The men present had made a decision in the immediate panic of that evening they convinced themselves was practical, and I believe they spent the rest of their lives not fully looking at. My father had been called afterward, not present for the incident itself, but called to help with what he obliquely described as the situation. He was young, he was trusted, he did what he was asked. He said he had thought about Thomas Briggs almost every day for 40 years. I believed him. I believed that the thinking about it had not been enough. I told him that. He didn't argue with me. I asked if Briggs was buried on the property. He said he didn't know. I think he meant it. I think the architecture of what these men had built was deliberately compartmentalized, so that each person knowing only their piece, so that no single conversation could collapse the structure. Diane published her investigation 4 months ago. It ran in the Burlington paper and was picked up by the State Wire and then by several national outlets. The headline was careful, as good journalism is. It described a decades-old cold case, documented connections between local officials, and noted that state police were opening an inquiry. It did not accuse anyone of murder, because we did not have evidence of murder. We had evidence of a cover-up, of obstruction, of a young man who had disappeared and been allowed to stay disappeared by people with power and motive. The state police inquiry is ongoing. Ground-penetrating radar was used on the former Alderman property, the community center grounds, in April. I don't know the results. That information has not been made public. I don't know if I will know before anyone else does, or at the same time, or after. My father has retained a lawyer. He has cooperated with investigators, I'm told, to the extent that an 80-year-old man who has told himself a certain story for 40 decades can cooperate. I don't know what charges, if any, will come. The men most responsible are dead. The law's reach into the past is limited in ways that are sometimes appropriate and sometimes an outrage, and I find myself unable to determine which this is. Harlow is different now. Not visibly, it still looks the same, the steeple and the bridge and the October trees, but the atmosphere has changed in the way atmospheres change when a truth has been introduced into a space that was organized around its absence. People are quieter. The general store feels different when I walk in. Some people look at me with something that might be gratitude and might be resentment and might be both at once. My father and I still speak. I don't know what to call what we are to each other now. The old word feels insufficient, and the absence of a word feels like a different kind of loss. We have coffee sometimes. We don't talk about it because we've said what there is to say, and the rest belongs to investigators and lawyers and whatever justice looks like when most of the people responsible have already died. I think about Thomas Briggs. I think about the 4 sentences at the bottom of page 3 of the September 14, 1983 Harlow Gazette, and the fact that he warranted 4 sentences and then silence. I think about whatever he saw or knew or said that made him inconvenient. I think about his name in the 1980 census, a real person living a real life in a real town that decided in one terrible evening that his life was less important than its own reputation. I don't know if we'll find him. I don't know if the ground will give up what it knows. I don't know if justice, in any meaningful sense, is still possible for a man who has been missing for 40 years. But his name is Thomas Alden Briggs. He was 34 years old in the fall of 1983. He worked seasonally, he existed, he mattered. And Harlow knows his name now. The whole town, the whole state knows his name. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. And in a town that spent 40 years perfecting the art of silence, it is at least a beginning.